Hey everybody, welcome to Flutter Atlanta. Thank you for stopping by. My name's Emmett Dean. I am the Flutter team lead here at Black Airplane. I have a mobile development background in native Android and iOS, and I've been using Flutter for over 2 years. We've published a whole bunch of different apps in Flutter, and I love it so much that I'm using my own startup. I just want to give a shout out to Black Airplane, which is our physical location here. Thank you for the food and the beer. We have a special team here that produces top quality work and is capable of producing extremely complex software. So if you're looking for help, reach out to Black Airplane. Today, we have a guest speaker. His name is Trey Hope. He does a lot on YouTube, on the YouTube channel Trey Codes. And today he's going to be talking about Firebase Authentication with your Flutter app. I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you, Emmett. Much appreciated. How's everyone doing?
Good.
Great.
Good. So, as Emmett mentioned, my name is Trey Hope. I'm a Flutter developer. I've been working with Flutter probably about a year after its release, so pretty long time now. And at this point, I just really enjoy talking about the ins and outs of Flutter, what I know about it. And today, I have the privilege of discussing something specific, Firebase Authentication. And with Firebase Authentication, it allows you to authenticate users into your app a little bit easier than say some other methods that are probably out there. And Firebase and Flutter go hand in hand, so I'll show you how you can set up some authentication in your app pretty seamlessly. So what is Firebase Authentication? Firebase Authentication is a backend service that provides easy to use SDKs as well as ready-made UI libraries to authenticate users to your app. It supports authentication via passwords, phone numbers, Google, Facebook, Twitter, and more. So as it's mentioned here, there's 2 ways you can really use the authentication for your app. They already have some UI-made libraries, so if you want to simply just drop a login page to your app and not have to worry about setting up the implementation yourself, you can do that. But if you are like me and you want to be more hands-on with your authentication setup, then you can do it manually, and I'll show you how to do it manually today. So how does it work? To sign a user into your app, you first get authentication credentials from the user. These credentials can be the user's email address and password, or an OAuth token from a federated identity provider. Then you pass these credentials to the Firebase Authentication SDK. Our backend services will then verify those credentials and return a response to the client. All right. So as you can see in the picture, this is pretty much a list of users, and I'll explain that here shortly. But every user that's authenticated to the app, it gets displayed in this users table right here. So after a successful sign-in, you can access the user's basic profile information, and you can control the user's access to data stored in other Firebase products. You can also use the provided authentication token to verify the identity of users in your own backend services. All right, so Firebase user properties. So every time that you authenticate a user to your app, you are essentially creating a Firebase user. The first time a user signs up to your app, the user's profile data is populated using the information available. If the user signed up with an email address and password, only the primary email address property is populated. If the user signed up with a federated identity provider such as Google or Facebook, the account information made available by the provider is used to populate the user's profile. If the user signed up with your custom auth system, you must explicitly add the information you want to the user's profile. Once a user account has been created, you can reload the user's information to incorporate any changes the user might have made on another device. As you can see here, these are the properties that come with a Firebase user object. So you have some basic things like a UID, the date they were created, their last login, email password, photo URL, display name, etc., etc. Keep in mind that if you want any information for your users outside of this object, then you'll need to persist that another way, maybe using Firestore, Cloud Firestore, or some other type of database. But for general purposes, this is a good start when it comes to understanding the users who've been authenticated into your app. So the first way that we'll talk about authenticating users is to authenticate via password. You can use Firebase Authentication to let your users authenticate with Firebase using email addresses and passwords. So I'll demonstrate that right now. So the first thing that you need to do is you need to come over. So this is in Firebase. I'm in the authentication section of my demos project, and we had to make sure that we enable the email and password. So what you would do is you would go to add new provider, look for that provider that you want to give access to, and then just check it. So as you can see, I already have email and password enabled, so we're good to go. The users table that I mentioned earlier, right now is completely clean. So right now, the demos project has no users in it. So I'll demonstrate adding our first user right now. All right, so within the project, I have a simple Flutter project here, and I'll explain the packages that you need in your pubspec.yaml file. So for this to work, we're using Firebase Auth version 3.2.0, Firebase Core version 1.10.5, and Google Sign-In version 5.4.0. All right, so this is pretty much all you need to get started out of the box. I went ahead and created a demo page here that's going to have the ability to listen for changes in the user's login and logout status. So Firebase Auth has its own class, and we instantiated it and gave it the auth name. And what we're simply doing is we create a stream builder in the demo page, and we listen for auth state changes on that object. So when a user logs in, it switches. When it logs out, it switches as well. The thing to note here is the data that is returned on this stream is the Firebase user, which I spoke about earlier. So since the user could be not logged in yet, it could be a nullable property. So we add the question mark here to make this user object nullable. So essentially, if the Firebase user is null, that means they are not logged in right now, and we display the unauthenticated page. But if they are, then we'll display this authenticated page down here. This logic right here is simply just to display a title for the authenticated page based on how that user was logged in. So for example, if the Firebase user does not have a phone number, or if they do have a phone number, then we will give the title of the authenticated page phone number. If the Firebase user has the is anonymous property true, then they've logged in anonymously, so we'll give the anonymous title. If their photo URL is not null, which means they have a picture, and we'll assume that they logged in with Google because we're going to be taking their photo from their Google account. Finally, if the Firebase user has an email, then we're assuming that they logged in via email and password. Otherwise, we'll say we had an error signing in, but we're not going to have any errors today. All right? So the authenticated page is just simply a simple page that's going to display the title of how they were authenticated, and then a message saying, welcome back user, and whatever their UID is for that Firebase user. We'll also display a sign out button that allows us to sign out and do it again with another provider. And then finally, we have the unauthenticated page, which is what you see right here. It just has a title that says unauthenticated, and then I created widgets for each type of provider that we'll be logging in with today. So the first one that we have, as I mentioned, is auth password. So let's go ahead and jump into this auth password class. So within the auth password class, we have two text editing controllers, one for email, one for password. And essentially what we want to do is we want to type in the email of our new account and then give it a password, and then we want to create that user first. So let's go ahead and do that now. So I'll type in my email and just give it a password, and then we'll hit create user. All right. And I put some breakpoints in here so that we can kind of walk through it. So as you can see, the email controller is my email, and the password is the password that I just typed in. So what we want to call when we're creating a user is this create user with email and password. This tries to create a new user account with a given email address and password. So we'll run through that. All right, it says the account was created. Now remember, since we just created the account, we technically logged in, so we are now authenticated by password. And the message says, welcome back user, blase, blase. All right, so I'll go back to this table, and if we refresh it, we can now see that I, Trey Hope, my email has been authenticated on July 14th, 2022, and this is my UID, okay? So that's how you use email and password. So we'll sign out. Now we're going to switch to authentication with phone. All right, so let me close this out. So in the auth phone class, we have, similar to the last one, we have two text editing fields. This time, one is for phone number and one is for the SMS code controller. So essentially what we want to do is we want to type in the phone number that we're going to be sending the code to, and then we will get that code, and then we will type it in here, verify it, and then we'll be authenticated that way. So Something to keep in mind, we also have this verification ID property, which I'll explain what it is a little bit later. But that's essentially a way that Firebase can know if we're using the right verification. Because it's going to need to compare that later on down the road. So within that, we have this verify method. So if the verification ID is null, then we're not going to do any verification yet. But if it's not, that means we're ready to verify. And we will take that SMS code that we got on our phone, create a credential, and then log in with that. So let's go ahead and demonstrate that right now. So I'll type in my number. Please don't send me any text, but this is just for demo purposes. So we'll hit send verification code. All right. And we get down to this verify phone number method. All right. So what this does, starts a phone number verification process for the given phone number. This method is used to verify that the user provided phone number belongs to the user. Firebase sends a code via SMS message to the phone number where you must then prompt the user to enter the code. The code can be combined with the verification ID to create a phone auth provider.credential, which you can then use to sign the user in or link with their account. All right. So the properties on here is we need to pass in that phone number that we got, which is my phone number, as you can see here. And then there's some other properties on here, such as verification completed. So when it's done, you can do something, but right now I'll just print a message out. There's also verification failed. So if something happens to go haywire, you can maybe display error message there. There's also a code auto retrievable timeout, and you can use this method when the timeout has pretty much ran out for sending the verification code. But really what we want to focus on is this code sent method. So when the code has been sent, we then want to save that verification ID for our use later. So let's go ahead and run through that. So what this does is it takes us to a verification page that's going to, it's a captcha that's looking for to solve a captcha. But since I solved it already, I guess it assumed that we're good. But essentially, that's what you would do right there. Something I forgot to mention was, in order to use the phone verification, we have to set up a reCAPTCHA verification. It's really simple how you do this. So you need to first, you need to add the custom URL schemes to your Xcode project. You open your project configuration, double click the project name in the left tree view, select your app from target section, then select the info tab and expand the URL type section. Then you'll click the plus button and add a URL scheme for your reverse client ID. To find this value, open the Google Service info.plist configuration file and look for the reverse client ID key. Copy the value of that key and paste it into the URL schemes box on the configuration page. Leave the other fields blank. And in here, I can never zoom in really on Xcode for some reason, but I'm in my demos project. I went to URL types and I just pasted in that reverse client ID on my Google info plist file. All right, so that's all you had to do to set up the reCAPTCHA. So since the reCAPTCHA already worked, now what we want to do is we want to enter in that code that was sent to the phone. So I just got a verification code, so I'll type that in now. 111893. All right, so now that we have that, we hit verify. And like I said, it's going to go through here and create this phone auth credential for us and then log us in. All right, so we have been authenticated by phone number. It's saying, welcome back user, blase, blase. We go back to our table again. We will now see that I also have been authenticated using my phone number. So the first time was email and password, so it was an email identifier. This one was phone number, so it has the phone number identifier. All right. Next, we want to authenticate anonymously. So let me get that set up. We'll be using our auth anonymous class. And I will sign out of here. All right, so to authenticate anonymously, you can use Firebase Authentication to create and use temporary anonymous accounts to authenticate with Firebase. These temporary anonymous accounts can be used to allow users who haven't yet signed up to your app to work with data protected by security rules. If an anonymous user decides to sign up to your app, you can link their sign-in credentials to the anonymous account so that they can continue to work with their protected data in future sessions. So to explain this in example, if you've ever used an app where it's like a shopping app and you want to sign in as a guest first, you don't have an account yet, but you'll sign in as a guest. And let's say you save like 10 items in your shopping cart. You can then come back later and say, hey, I want to sign in with my actual email address now. What you can do in Firebase is link those credentials together. That way, the data that you had in the anonymous account is not erased, and it can now be associated with that email account. I won't do that today because that's a lot of behind the work, but just know that when logging in anonymously, you can link it to other providers later on down the line. So we'll go to our anonymous class. And the good thing about anonymous, as you can assume, is we don't need to type in anything. So we don't have any text editing controllers or anything like that. The only thing we need to do is call this sign in anonymously method. So what this does is it asynchronously creates and becomes an anonymous user. If there's already an anonymous user signed in, that user will be returned instead. If there is any other existing user signed in, that user will be signed up. Okay? So very quick and simple. Let's just sign in anonymously. All right. Then we'll run through that. And now we have been authenticated by anonymous. Welcome back, user, UID. Let's go back to our user table in authentication. And as you can see now, it says anonymous. So that means that I was logged in anonymously to this app. Very helpful whenever you have some type of features in your app where you don't require a lot of sign up or just extra information. You just want to get the users rolling as quickly as possible. Finally, we're going to authenticate via federated identity and social sign-in. So let me get that going. So we'll comment auth anonymous out and auth Google class. All right, and we'll hit sign out. All right, so social authentication is a multi-step authentication flow allowing you to sign a user into an account or link them with an existing one. Both native platforms and web support creating a credential which can then be passed to the sign-in with credential or linked with credential methods. Alternatively, on web platforms, you can trigger the authentication process via a pop-up or redirect. So in here, as I forgot to mention, but we pretty much enabled all our providers that we've been working with so far. But when we would need to add Google, we would do it that way. Something to keep in mind is you can authenticate your app with a bunch of other providers like Facebook, Apple, Game Center, Microsoft, Yahoo, and everything. But since they're all technically social providers, I'm just going to do Google for this demonstration. So if we go back, and I'll get this set up so we can see it. Go to our app, all right? And within here, we have this sign in with Google method. And what this is going to do is going to trigger the authentication flow for us by calling that Google sign in class. And we got that using the Google sign in package from Flutter that I mentioned earlier. Then we're going to obtain the auth details from the quest, create a new credential, and then asynchronously sign into Firebase with the given third-party credentials. So this will work for, like I said, Facebook, Twitter, all the other ones. But we're using Google for this demonstration. So I will show you what that looks like now. So we are unauthenticated currently. If we hit Google sign in, it's going to run through its magic. And now it's going to ask me, well, not ask me, it's going to tell me actually. Demos wants to use google.com to sign in. This allows the app and website to share information about you. So we'll hit continue. So now it's going to pop up this window and it's going to show us that to go to our project, and you can change that project name however you want, but it's going to list all of the Gmail accounts that you currently have on this device. Right now, I only have my trey.a.hope Gmail, so we'll be logging in with that. All right, just like that, authenticated by Google. Welcome back, user, UID. And if we come back to our table, we're going to notice something interesting. If you see right here, I already logged in with trey.a.hope@gmail.com via email and password, but since I just used it for Google, now that email has been assigned to the Google provider. So the thing with Firebase is authentication is you can only be linked to one provider at a time. If you want to share them, like I mentioned earlier, you'll have to link them together. So what I would have to do is I would have to go in and call a link with credential method to link that Google provider with my email and password. That way I can share these. All right. And that is essentially how you use Firebase authentication with those several providers. Are there any questions?
So, just as a general feel for things, what is the type of scale of applications that you typically would rely on Firebase to be your back-end authentication mechanism?
What do you mean by scale?
Well, okay, so one of the apps that I manage has about 3 million users, active users. Okay. Have you seen any problems with having that number of users and, as Firebase backend managing it, or do you typically use another backend authentication mechanism?
Yeah, that's a good question. I personally have never had that many users to an app. I would love to have 3 million, but the most I've probably dealt with is maybe 1,000, and I haven't seen any type of slow load times or any issues when it comes to linking accounts. So I would assume that with 3 million, you're safe.
Yeah.
And a lot of people that I know that use authentication for their apps, they go to Firebase because it works so seamlessly with Flutter. So I personally don't think that you would have an issue scaling with that.
Firebase is pretty capable for things like that. It's built on top of Google Cloud Platform. Depending on the authentication provider that you use, that's probably where you're actually going to hit your limits.
Yeah.
And it's also important to note that phone authentication is going to be way more expensive to implement at a scale like that than email and password, because you do get charged for the text messages getting sent out. So that's important to note as well. But as for scaling, that's a large reason why people use Firebase, is just because it scales without you having to worry.
Gotcha. So another question for you, and this might be a little more theoretical than anything. Over the past couple months, we've gone through Google I/O and Apple's WWDC. And one of the things that came out in WWDC was the context of a passwordless authentication mechanism. We're using using the iCloud keychain to maintain your credentials. Have you seen Firebase kind of move in that direction? Because it was supposed to be Apple, Microsoft, Google, and a couple other people kind of getting the consortium. Any reaction, or have you seen anything like that going on these days?
The last that I have seen personally is now if you use any sort of single sign-on with while publishing an Apple app, you also have to support sign-in with Apple. Right. So that might be the direct way that they're trying to implement that, and that's just kind of forced across all iOS apps now. Another thing interesting to mention is Apple also, with that push, has also now released a privacy push that is you need to be able to delete all user data. So Firebase actually has some extensions, which are their pre-built cloud functions if you're using Firestore to store some of that data, to automatically kind of delete pretty seamlessly all of that data. So they're trying to make it as easy for you to conform to those new requirements.
I saw Apple as one of the authentication mechanisms up there.
Yeah.
Right. And again, this may be more of a Firebase question than a Flutter question. So one of the things I typically see is you have the validation time of an authentication token. So it's good for 24 hours, 10 days, something like this, before you force someone to come back and re-authenticate. Do you see that type of behavior in the type of applications that you do, and how would you kind of think about that within the context of your application?
So when I've used Firebase Authentication for my apps, the token actually doesn't expire. I've been able to, I have a mobile app called Critic where, let's say I log in Sunday, I can come back next month and I'm still logged in. So honestly, I haven't really seen too many issues with a token expiring in that sense. You would have to delete the app or sign out for it to expire essentially. So it does a very good job of persisting that for long periods of time.
From my understanding, the providers that it has normally with you're kind of describing an OAuth 2 flow from my understanding. Mm-hmm. So typically you have a refresh token kind of endpoint that you'll have to hit to refresh. I believe with the providers that Firebase has, it will automatically handle that for you. They do have a solution to tie into Firebase Authentication if you want to hook up your own custom OAuth 2 flow. So I've done like a Twitch login before, and they had kind of a refresh token endpoint, and you had to implement that and handle the refresh yourself. So if it's not one of the providers, you can still utilize all of the great things with Firebase Authentication. You just kind of have to do the implementation work yourself there. We've also used Okta, which is a popular, more enterprise authentication solution.
I didn't know you can log in with Twitch.
Cool. Yeah, you have to. Yeah, pretty cool.
That's cool.
Okay, this is the last question, but how about the next one? What about biometrics? So if you have, face identity, touch, on either platform, Android or iOS, how does that tie in with authentication within Flutter and Firebase?
So to my knowledge, and I don't know, if you've seen this or not, I don't know if they have incorporated biometrics into the authentication flow yet. Yeah. That's definitely something that is necessary at this point. I know where the apps are headed. A lot of things are using biometrics now. So I wouldn't be surprised if it was incorporated later on, maybe this year. But as of right now, they don't do biometrics, I don't believe.
Yeah, from what I've seen is it's probably not going to be like a standalone provider. The way I've seen it implemented in apps most commonly is like I'm already logged in, but to open the app, even though I'm already logged in, it's got to do Face ID. A lot of times your banking apps will offer this. So I've seen it kind of in conjunction with a more traditional provider, but not standalone.
Yeah. You talked about linking IDs and stuff, and obviously you came in with the intention of coming in with individual non-connected content, even though it was you, right, your credentials. So how would you see or work with Firebase, or I'm not quite sure what you do in the context of your Flutter app, but somebody logs in first time with an email address. Then they log in and says, oh, my profile includes that phone number, right? Can you get the user, the GUID or the user ID to match against those two numbers? So if you come in with a phone number, it's the user ID. If you come in with an email, it's the same user ID.
Yes.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you would essentially link those credentials. So that's some extra work that the developer had to do on their end to handle that. If it would check to see if, all right, if I'm logging in with this user, there's already a user in our table that has this email, but they're logging in with phone number. So we would need to associate those two somehow. Or if they're logging in with phone number this time, they're logging in with Google. Or they logged in with phone number first, but now they're logging in with Google. You would have to do some type of back-end work to check and see, hey, we already have a user with this email or phone number. We need to associate these two somehow.
Okay.
So Firebase definitely makes that possible for you to handle that scenario.
Great questions.
Yes, very great question.
That's all you had?
No, I'm thinking of
Got five more.
In a second.
I have a question about the anonymous login.
Yes.
I work on the security side, not developer, but so what is the unique identifier that it pulls if you go back to it, that you can access it knows it's you anonymously visiting it again? To then tie it to a login credential. Like, is it pulling like the MAC address from the device? I mean, what is it like associating it with to say like this is this one anonymous user out of the 50 potentially using it?
Yes, so I think, if I'm not mistaken, when you log in anonymously, it knows, I guess,
Like
the last instance that you were logged in at. So let's say I logged in anonymously and logged out. I think it somehow knows that you logged in anonymously previously, so then now if I log in with Google, it would associate those two somehow. That's a great question. I'm not sure how
like what is the unique identifier to even know that?
Because with the anonymous, there is no information that's brought back.
It's going to be similar to a cookie system.
Okay.
So it's not something that will persist you uninstalling the app.
Right.
So that's something.
Captures the session and says like, okay, session's still allowed, you can revisit.
When we've provided it for some of our clients here, we've told them that like only doing anonymous sign-in allows you to kind of track user data without having to deal with all of the sign-in logic.
Right.
But if they were to get a new phone or uninstall and reinstall the app, they're instantly going to lose all of that unless they link a better provider.
You're coming from a different platform.
Yep.
Yeah. So speaking about authentication, anonymous users. So obviously, if you allow this to happen in the behavior application, you're going to start collecting a lot of anonymous users in your database table. Is there any type of methods within Firebase to clean things up and say, if anybody hasn't been in here in the past week, clear up the data?
There is ways that you can manually delete authenticated users.
Anonymous users, or?
Yeah,
Okay.
any authenticated user,
Gotcha.
just Google anonymous or phone number. There isn't a way to determine if this user hasn't been logged in recently. There's no way to do that yet. So if you want to do that, you would have to do some logic on your end to say,
Purging schedule of some sort, say like every 7 days.
7 days, and then
delete
check,
anonymous.
like a time interval, and then it would check and say, okay, this user hasn't logged in 30 days, we'll delete that person.
Yeah.
But out of the box, Firebase doesn't have something that will check and see if the user hasn't recently logged in or not.
Can you pull up the Firebase console again?
Yes.
If you
So-
wanted to keep this in the Firebase suite, though, Firebase does have cloud functions, so you could deploy a cloud function on Firebase's
Yeah, on
system,
GCP.
and that would automatically do that for you.
Gotcha. So that was a created and signed in thing. So you can probably say, if you're anonymous, created such and such, you haven't been in for 2 weeks, clear the data.
Yep.
Okay, that's cool.
I think people are freaked out about the OAuth thing now with the GitHub breach that happened. The tokens
hear
that
about
were
that.
yeah, it happened like a month or two ago. And they basically had like credentials and clear text, and the tokens were actually, the user tokens were breached and
Yeah.
stolen, and people were logging in with those and accessing.
Did they fix it? They put a.
They fixed it. They purged the creds out. They fixed it. But yeah, I think the OAuth, the 2 has still a ways to go
Yeah.
to be truly secure.
Yeah, definitely. That's good. I didn't know about that. But good thing I don't log in with GitHub. I just
Yeah.
Google and email or Apple usually.
Apple's.
Yeah, Apple and Google.
So speaking of passwords, as far as Firebase is concerned, you had a profile screen on one side and had the username and the password. How visible is that password to you in the context of, the console user? I mean, is it encrypted, visible?
The password on the
Yeah, so if you go to the Trey Hope one, the one at the bottom, and
Here.
hit the profile, can you pull up the profile of that user?
you can't open a profile on this one. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, what's the document icon at the end?
That's just to copy the UID.
Okay.
So you showed that screen in your slides earlier, which showed all the possible fields on a Firebase user object.
Oh, yeah. Let me,
Do you see the password in clear text?
That one.
Oh, no. So the passwords are all encrypted.
Okay.
Like when you get the password to Firebase, that's the last time I saw the word password. From there, it's just going to use that encryption to log in. So everything is secure that way.
Okay, but I guess, and kind of going back to the password breach type of a context, if that was to come out or whatever, I mean, I assume it's encrypted as soon as you make the account.
Yeah. Once you call create user with email or password, it automatically starts the encryption for that password.
It's kind of this situation where, like, if you were using Stripe to process payments, it's like after you just send the information, you're never really storing it on the device. So I believe that Firebase is taking on most of the liability there. And if there was some sort of password breach, they would notify you, and it would be on you to notify your users.
That's what they said they did with GitHub. They just basically did an automatic password reset for everybody.
Yeah.
To rectify it.
Yeah.
Congratulations, now you have to remember your old password.
Who knows their passwords anyways?
That's good, I appreciate the point of view here.
Absolutely. Thank you for the questions. Appreciate it.
Where do you think this, we did a kind of a really quick, okay, here's the different methods of going in and authenticating in the context of Firebase. As you start developing your applications, where does your complexity come into play? Like, as so you've got authentication in place, but how do you then improve the functionality or the protection of the application, and what do you have to take into account for, especially in Dart or whatever?
I'm not exactly sure the question that you're asking. The complexity of authentication.
Maybe like a role system is kind of what you're describing.
Yeah, as things get, so for example, you got roles here of a particular user, admin or moderator. So I'm guessing, and I'm just kind of projecting a little bit, right? That going back to your point, you probably have to have a GCP app out there to kind of take advantage of certain things for more of an administrative portal type of viewpoint of things. And then from a mobile standpoint, you just have to kind of conform to whatever the user object is going to be to give you other functionality and how to move the application along.
So depending on what services you want to build it, Firestore, if you're going to use Firebase's database, they have a rules system, and you can kind of build out a role system based on, are you authenticated, only allow you to access certain data if you're authenticated. Inside your application, you can actually build almost like paywall style or auth wall style stuff. If you were going to have like a completely separate backend application with Node.js or Laravel or whatever you're going to do, then you could build out the role system there and just use that unique ID as you would from another auth system. So it does rely outside of that to determine the unlocks of what you can do.
This is the rules table that Em is talking about, and they have this for Firebase storage, database, and some other sections of the app as well. But essentially, this is how you would assign roles, I guess. You can tell if they're authenticated, if they have the right user ID, if they have the right properties on that user object in the table, things like that. You would apply all that logic here.
Okay.
Great question, though.
So going back to the user object context, do you find that Firebase Authentication pretty much focuses on the user ID and the password components of a user object, and the rest of the attributes that you might give a user would be in a separate database? So let me give you an example. Let's say you have a restaurant application. You want to order food from a restaurant, but they have like, do you want to be marketed to? Can I send you a message? Can I send you an email? Your privacy check. A lot of metadata around permissions that has nothing to do with authentication,
Right.
but it has something to do with the experience of the user in the context of the application.
Right.
Does that metadata go into the Firebase authentication engine, or do you keep it separate?
So you would have to keep that separate. So
Okay.
essentially, these properties are the things that come with the Firebase user. So like you said, for the restaurant app, if they need to have some extra information, what was an example of something you just said?
Well, like marketing information or
Marketing
preferences or loyalty or whatever, like a number of some sort, yeah.
So all that information would not be on that Firebase user object. You would instead want to put that in a cloud Firestore database or MongoDB or something else like that.
Gotcha.
And then since every Firebase user has a UID,
Yep.
you would make sure that you save that UID on that user object in your table
Gotcha.
and then associate it that way.
It's pretty common now to just have a user's collection in your Firestore database because every app is going to have specific user data that expands upon this. So that's pretty common. You're either going to have more information than you can put in here, or you're going to have specific settings that you want to save on the user. So that's pretty traditional.
Thank you, sir. You dance very well.
Thank you. Try. Any other questions?
I answered a couple for Randall online just to recap them in case they're interesting for anybody else. He mentioned something about Amplify Authenticator. I believe this is Amazon's option. I have not used it yet, but he was asking if they had anything like that for Firebase Auth. I believe it's like an out-of-the-box Firebase Auth implementation, and they do have one of those. It's called like Flutterfire UI or something like that. That basically is that out-of-the-box sign-up page that you were describing at the beginning.
Flutterfire, yeah.
Yep. So if you do want a pre-built UI page, it works out of the box very quickly, but there's less customization. So it's normally worth learning kind of how to set it up custom.
Yeah. The out-of-the-box UIs are very simple. It's literally email, password, and then your company logo, but you can't modify the background, the color, the text, fonts, anything like that. So I personally use the manual way to set up the authentication. But it's very helpful if you're just having a very simple app and you don't want to get too heavy in the details.
Or if you need a temporary solution to get more into the meat of things while you're developing, it's great for that.
What about step-up authentication? You know, like one-time password checks, using the Google Authenticator, that type of thing. Is that still aligned with the Google Authentication platform? Would you leverage it at that point, or how would you take advantage of that in your application?
So they have passwordless sign-in, which it's more of an emailed style, so it emails you a magic link, as they call it,
Yep.
and you click that and it'll automatically sign you in. I have not done any work with the Google Authenticator itself. If I were going to assume that might be a separate API, I'm not sure. Will you click add a new provider there?
Yeah. So they don't have that.
Yeah, so I assume it'd be kind of a separate API if you needed the extra authentication. But as you saw under the email password setup is where they had the passwordless sign-in.
The email link, the email link that you're talking about is the same thing within the email password section. You would just need to enable this right here, the email link password. I actually wanted to demonstrate this, but for some reason, I don't know if it's just not working. I couldn't get it to work, and I was looking all through Stack Overflow to figure out why. But it was not working for some reason. I don't know if I didn't have the right domains whitelisted properly, or if there was something else. But if you did want to have the passwordless sign-in, you would just come in here and enable that way.
Out of the box also, for email, it does support sending verification emails if you want to force verification, and it does store on the user objects if they've been verified before. So that.
Now, is this the free version of Firebase, or if you pay for the next level, do you get extra functionality in it?
So this is all completely free.
Right.
The only thing to keep in mind is for the phone provider, it charges, I think after you get 50 messages a day, after that they charge like 50 cents per message. So what you would need to do is make sure that you're on an increased plan, so that way you can use unlimited messaging for that. But if you're not using the phone provider, then everything else is completely free one.
It's like any Google product now. They give you that really generous free tier to build out whatever you want on it, and then after you go live, you're stuck on that forever paying whatever their bill is.
Yes.
Authentication, do you also set like the lockout policy here, or where's that done? I mean, so you make sure, is there a default for that that's already in place, or do you set that? Have a
Logout
standard?
policy.
Like if someone logs in 10 times with the wrong password, right? Like brute force. Is there a way to say like after X amount of times, like the account's locked?
So
Is that through here or is that somewhere else?
So that's something else. That's something that you would manually need to do. Firebase, it can only check if the password was wrong,
Okay.
if the user doesn't exist, if they were recently deleted, just situations like that. But as far as how many logins, you can log in 1,000 times. Firebase won't do anything to stop that, but you would have to manually just keep like a counter variable and let them know that they failed 3 times. Try again later. But
Okay.
right now, Firebase doesn't.
So Firebase is keeping the logs of the authenticated successful logins, but not the attempted?
Well, it doesn't necessarily keep count of how
It's just
many
saying
successful ones.
disauthenticated.
Yeah, it
and
just
that's
says
it.
authenticated.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so you probably look for your like web server logs then or something for,
Possibly.
okay.
That might be a good place to look.
The only one that it will try and block for single sign-on will block because just integrated into single sign-on like the
Yeah.
Google provider. Phone, they have that reCAPTCHA level to try and stop bots, but email password was truly just to be as raw and as simple as possible. So any added security features around that will be on the developer to implement.
Okay, and that's, again, I'm not a developer, so was that outside of Firebase then? That's other
It can be. It
things that
can.
you add to your suite?
It can just be like app logic, so I can just in my app count how many times you've tried to log in,
Okay.
and after a certain thing, just be
Set
like,
it to,
yeah.
block.
Yeah.
Block out, okay. Interesting.
And real quick, let me see if I can try the reCAPTCHA again because we weren't able to fully see it for the phone provider. Maybe we can try it again and it'll work this time. Let's sign out. Give his phone number again. Do that. All right. I guess since I already did it, it's cool, but that small window will pop up. It'll pretty much say select the squares that are traffic lights and you select them to
Yeah,
prove you're not a
they're
profile.
annoying.
Just want to put that out there because we didn't get to see it.
Guess which one's a bridge? Yeah.
Any other questions?
Where would you find samples of code necessary to kind of follow this if one was so inclined to play with this on their own?
So I plan on putting this on my GitHub, so I'll share that as well. But Firebase documentation is very, very good. They explain it in great detail. Let's see if I can pull that up real quick. Authentication, Flutter. Well, that is one, but I like to use the firebase.google.com. So yeah, this website does a good job of explaining how authentication works on all platforms, whether it be iOS, Android, web, Unity, etc. And then it breaks down how to use each of them, which I mentioned today, the password, the email link, social, phone number, etc., etc. So the Firebase documentation is exceptionally well for this.
Go.
Thank you.
What is the next Flutter meetup?
Do you have the date pulled up?
Same time tomorrow night.
I will.
Just to wrap us up here, next time we're going to be talking about building for desktop. Flutter recently announced stable support for desktop on Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. So we're going to just kind of talk about if you're going to go build a desktop app tomorrow, what other considerations you're going to have to take on. So if that's interesting, that will be our topic next month.
August 11th.
On August 11th. So we will see you guys then.
Save the date.
Thank you again, Trey, for doing this. Go check out his YouTube channel at Trey Codes.
And if you're local and you're watching virtually, you miss out on this amazing happy hour we're about to go do after. So come next time.
So come in person.